More mileage from your garden, chapter 2. I call it history, getting into history and future. Still working on the same outline, but now moving into pages 3 and 4. Starting with Eastern white pine, which Steve put on the list. That one had its name for 2,000 years or more. The Romans already called it pine. Strobus just means that the cones scales overlap. So it's the white pine that's there. It's that big, it at first is a pyramidal tree and fluffy and pretty and like a teddy bear. But as it gets older, it becomes quite statuesque and windswept and open, a big tree. Right now, our biggest ones are probably about 150 feet up in the Porcupine Mountains, or arguments, there's some that might be in the Great Smokies that are as big. But when the settlers got here, they were 200 feet and more. They live easily 400 or 500 years. Now, what would happen when people started coming and looking around here is that they would get yellow powder all over the deck. They called it brimstone on the deck because there were so many pines near the shore, and all of that pollen floating around in the springtime would coat the decks. And this amazed people who were coming from an old world that had already stripped out all its forests. By the 1300s, there really were no forests left in much of Europe. And by the mid 1500s, people were freezing because there was not any wood to burn in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. To build ships, they were having to go and trade with the Baltic nations, going over to Russia and the far side of Sweden to get trees. And there, the English were having to vie with the Portuguese and the Spanish and the French over the wood. So to look and see that abundance of timber, and I love this saying, principally pine, fitted for masts or good for masts and yards of ships, on which His Serene Majesty, the King of Portugal, anticipates the greatest profit from this country in providing timber. That's what they saw. They saw unlimited timber. They saw hills covered with trees where they had come from the place where, at best, they had trees that were along edges of farmers' fields. But most of them lived in places, this is Amsterdam, but much of Europe was at that point, some of these houses are 1600s houses, was paved and citified. But they were able to go right close to shore and look at trees and look up into huge trees and say, that would make the greatest mast. And that's what Eastern white pine does. No matter what you do to an Eastern white pine, it ends up growing itself back up straight. And here there were trunks that were 8 feet across at the base and 200 feet tall to make a single spur, a single piece mast for ships. That's all they could see, was that was there. Straight trunk all the way up. And that's one of the reasons that this whole area was colonized. But we were so greedy. The first business to open in most towns that set up in the colonies was a sawmill. By 1700, and you know that in the 1650s, we already were losing people to cold and trying to colonize here. By 1700, there were 70 sawmills working where 2 men could put out 1,000 linear feet of lumber a day, 250 by 800. Billions of square yards of virgin lumber shipped out to the colonies, including 300 masts a year. When I was looking up at that, I went 300 trees over 200 feet tall, over 200 years old, cut down just so they could be a mast for a ship. And they were shipped out. They came out of places like this. They figured out how to skid out a tree that big, how to drop it down without breaking it, how to get it all the way to the coast. Then how did they get it to England? I'm still working on this one. And this is one that I have 2 military history buffs in the family. And so they're helping me with, and it's getting them involved in my garden. Here's a ship of the line. And if you look at the masts and just look at the proportions here, the masts are taller than the length of the whole ship. How did they ship 300 masts? We found a reference that said there was a specially designed ship, but I still don't understand how they fit those masts. I know they carried spare masts or spare parts of masts, but that's the questions remain and become mileage. But this is what our avarice for wood did, and what all of the lumber that they needed in Europe did. This is in Ontario now. If you look here, this is all lumbered out. The only firs and pines that are left are along what legally they have to leave along the waterway. And this is happening as far as you can see to the horizon still, because that's the kind of way that we look at trees, just along the waterway. leaving just the trees that used to have company and don't have anybody next to them anymore, but still standing and still standing strong. These are survivors of an ice age. The glaciers came down to the yellow line, but the green is where white pines are now native and thick, like you just saw in that picture where they were doing the lumbering. Every place that the glaciers retreated, pines are making 4.5 million seeds an acre. And they don't sprout well underneath pines. They sprout well next to pines. So they very quickly colonize. They're survivors. I think they'll still be around. We think they're big, but this is nothing. This is an 80-foot tree. Think of a tree at least twice this tall is what used to be here and maybe could be here again. And then the bald eagles will be nesting in them again because it's a real high wildlife plant. Your fledgling eagles, this one was so silly that a gull was able to chase him away because he was still a youngster. But the tops of those mountains will someday again be white pines, not just in the New England fall colors. Vermont has got quite a program going to try to reforest a lot of those areas. Peony is the next plant I looked at, and ye gods, lots of kid stories in peony. Peony is named for the physician Peon, who was the physician to the gods and who healed Pluto after Hercules beat him up and had to be hidden from Zeus. And so he was turned into a peony. We was for a long time. As a plant, this physician cures about 20 things according to traditional medicine. For us and for most of the people in the West who found the peonies, they came from from Crete, from Turkey, from the Far East. None of them are New World plants. But when people found them and started hybridizing and crossing the Chinese milky flowered peony with the ones that the Romans and the Greeks had, they got lots of wonderful things. And there again are those anthocyanins, the red as it comes up in the springtime. Peony petals, peony leaves, they do have medicinal plants in it. Now, because it was a plant that was used medicinally in Asia, as well as in the Greco-Roman times, there were people who collected plants for the medical people. And they were, that was a good job to have. It was a cushy job to have. It was a respected job to have. So you didn't want other people to take your job. So they came up with stories to scare people from digging plants. For instance, you would go blind if you harvested peony at the wrong time of the lunar cycle, or if you had to dig it in the dark. Even by the 17th century, so we're talking hundreds of years later, Gerard in his Herbal said, these superstitious and wicked ceremonies found in the books of the most ancient writers. And he was talking about peonies. We still today have an echo of those in there where people say, oh, you're not supposed to disturb a peony. There's no reason to avoid disturbing peonies. They disturb millions of them every year selling them, but that still holds true. And it all traces back to medicine. They used the roots. They took the roots and ground up the root part there. That part there was valuable. And it was the crossing of all of these different continental peonies, the tree peonies from China and the milky flowered peonies from Asia, that there were already 750 kinds of them, varieties of them, different colors, different heights, different leaf types when the Europeans totally discovered them. But once they brought those over, everybody kind of went nuts. And maybe the physicians have the last laugh, because now if you look those peonies up, it's peoniflorin is in the peony root. It's antispasmodic if you have stomach gripes. It reduces blood pressure. It reduces fever, and it's full of antioxidants. So maybe they were right in the long run. Beautiful plants, tree peonies, and now crossed with the herbaceous peonies. So we've got a whole new range of colors, but still those beautiful reds as the tree peony comes up. And that's one way to tell the tree peonies are grafted to a nurse stock, to a herbaceous peony to get them started. And if it doesn't take well, you can get regular peony coming up in your tree peony. And in the spring is the time to tell which ones are coming up that you need to weed out. You need to get rid of the ones that are not supposed to be coming up. And maybe the physician is telling us, scrub up, like today, always clean your hands. The most important thing to do with peony is to clean up. Right there on that peony shoot just coming up, there's cold damage. And by the time it gets up to here, with the bud for the flower for this year sitting at the top, there is cold damage up there, damage to the tips of the leaves. And if the old foliage or stems are left there, they're full of the fungus spores from last year's 2 leaf problems that peony has. And they've reinfected these on the damaged parts as they go up. You need to cut everything off, all the way down to the ground off of a peony, because there's damage from the cold. And on that bud now, there's decay starting that's going to sporulate and damage the leaves that were also hurt in the cold and cause botrytis and leaf spot, which moves down through the stem and into the root and decays the root too. So clean up your peonies. Think about the position as you do it. And don't worry about the ants. If it bothers you to have ants because you want to use peonies as cut flowers, cut them before they start opening. Cut them when they are, as my friend Burdette called it, like a marshmallow, about the size of a marshmallow and the feel, a little bit cushy. Cut them then, wrap them in plastic wrap tightly so that the end of the stem is sealed, and put them in your refrigerator. You can take them out weeks later, a month and a half later, and put them in water, and they'll still open without ants. Then there's 7 sun shrub, which might be my last plant here because I think we're just about out of time. 7 sun shrub, Haptocodium meconioides. It's kind of a gawky looking plant when it first gets started, but give it some time. It's called a shrub, but it's a small tree. It sorts itself out pretty well. It's very fast growing, has nice bark, kind of shaggy, peeling, whitish tan bark. And when it blooms, it's a keeper. Everybody loves it. There's that gentian next to it. Don't look at the gentian. Look at the 7 sun. There's the 7 sun. And it's called 7 sun because there's a single flower circled for you there. This whole thing is called a thyrse, the group of flowers, but that right there is one inflorescence. And on it, there are 6 flower buds arranged around the outside. 1, 2, 3 is hiding behind, 4, 5, 6, and 1 in the middle, 7. So it's named Haptocodium for hepta, 7, codium, poppy heads. They're like little poppy heads. Haptocodium, and meconioides is for meconia. This plant has this flower and this big leaf. It's a weed in Hawaii, but whoever found it, and we'll get to that, whoever found it felt that it had the 7 flowers and its flower structure looked like meconia. So it became Haptocodium meconioides. Terrible name, but you can't really blame them. These guys were collecting. Chinese Wilson, Edward Chinese Wilson, collected for 27 years in Thailand, Burma, China, what's now Vietnam, and collected 80,000, I think, specimens on a number of those trips. So coming up with names was sometimes difficult to do. This is Chinese Wilson right here, and this is Charles Sargent, for whom the Sargent crab is named, and who was the director of the Arnold Arboretum. He sent Chinese Wilson to China. There he is in China. In some places, he actually disguised himself as a native person, broke his leg collecting the regal lily, and limped for the rest of his life on that, but kept going back. He saw Haptocodium in China. It's a rare tree there. He saw it, but it was in bloom, not anything he could collect. It wasn't until, and that was in 1906. It wasn't until 1980 that seed was collected from some trees and given to a current expedition that went over from the Arnold Arboretum and the National Arboretum, and they brought the seeds home. It's just not a tree that occurs very much at all in China. Those are the seed pods. Aren't they pretty? It blooms in August and early September, and then these seed pods are pinky purple in the fall. So it came back in 1980, and they wrote about it in Arnoldia, the magazine of the Arnold Arboretum that described it. Steve and I saw the very first one, and we've planted a number of them because we really like it a lot, but we found the trouble with rarity. From that first collection came some seeds. Some went to the National Arboretum, some went to the Arnold Arboretum. A handful of plants was grown from them, and then all the seeds came from one plant. For a while, we were growing these at the Arnold Arboretum. This is the original one. It used to be in a nursery stock area when Steve and I looked through the fence to see it in 1986. Now it's out in the open. But since it's the only stock, if it has a problem, genetically, its offspring can have a problem too. And so for a while, we grew them and thought, This is a trouble-free plant. The bugs don't bother it. The diseases don't bother it. But that's been 30 years now. And now we're seeing canker. This is an infection of the wood, of the young wood, that the fungus gets in and continues to live there and continues to keep destroying cambium as the tree tries to grow. It probably starts here when the plant is young. We don't know what canker it is, but gets established. And if that branch lives, is now in the branch and killing the branch. So we might still have to send somebody back to collect more. And it's a very rare plant. This is a current, well, this was a 1980s expedition that went to Colombia, but it's still happening. People are still going and risking themselves climbing mountains. Our own David Michener has been in the way out back in China and in Siberia collecting. So maybe they'll collect some more. I hope so, because we have lost the Franklinia tree that John Bartram collected. It only exists in gardens. And maybe the Haptocodium, this is the one that we planted and is still at the Detroit Zoo by the kangaroo exhibit. Maybe these will become the conservation of the species, just like this is the Franklinia tree's flower. It also flowers in August. But whatever it is, the monarchs approve. You probably can't see. This is a young Haptocodium in Royal Oak. We plant, I think it's 2 years growing now. But if you look close, it's absolutely loaded with monarchs. Absolutely, it was alive. It was just moving everywhere with them because it's at the perfect time of year for these migrants who need to beef up before they head south. Pretty cool, huh? So that's the Haptocodium. Now that's chapter 2. I'll record chapter 3 and we'll put it up, but I won't keep anyone here because we're already over time. Are there any questions that we can handle before you need to take off?
Yes, we do have a few, Janet. I'm just going to run through them. First of all, I'd just like to say, unfortunately, David Michener was with us. He just had to leave for a meeting, but he wanted me to say hello. And
he is a wonderful person and a good friend. Thank you.
He is, and I'm sure he's, after his meeting, he'll be off to hunt for some more plants. But he stayed for the peony portion of it, of course. Okay, yep. So back to goat's beard. Yes. We have questions about what its soil needs are, exposure, and will it self-seed if you have both sexes?
It will self-seed. Some people consider that a problem. I don't, because they will hybridize. There are a couple of species of goat's beard. There is our eastern goat's beard, and then there is one that came from, where does Fusiformes come from? It might be from Korea. A little bitty one, and they will cross and you get great things that happen. But you do need to have a male and female, so you need to have a couple of plants. Okay. They belong in the woods, in the cool woods, never where it's hot. And as long as the soil does not get excessively dry, so as long as you're getting normal water, they're great. Now they take time. They live as long as a peony. And there's no reason to ever dig them up and move them around. They're kind of hard to move around, but it'll take a couple, 3 years before they get up some size. And then they're spectacular and they belong in the woods. They stand up straight as can be in the darkest woods. They're just a beautiful plant.
Excellent. Okay. With regard to the peonies, Brandon had a question about the timeline on that. When should we be looking for that cold damage?
Almost as soon as peonies come out in the spring, you worry about cold damage. It's one of the reasons that it's a good idea to put peonies on the north or the east side, so that as in the springtime, when it is cold in the morning, it doesn't get warm real fast, and that big change in temperature damages the leaves. If they're on the west side of the building, they sit there cold all morning, and then suddenly they get hit with the hotter sun. There's more damage there. We've just told a couple of people that we've gardened with and consulted with for quite a long time that their peony looked to us like that's what its problem was this spring. It was a tough spring last spring. To put a hat over it, to put stakes on either side, and just put a piece of cheesecloth or something over the top to keep some ground warmth around it in the spring. In an exposed area like that, because they live in a windy neighborhood and they still want to have their peony. Yeah,
okay. And now with regard to wrapping the peonies, there was a question, are you wrapping, when you're talking about cutting them in bud, are you wrapping the flower bud and the stem, just the stem?
Yep. The whole stem and flower, you're laying it down on a piece of plastic wrap and rolling it up and sealing it up tight and just putting it in the refrigerator.
Okay. I'm not going to pronounce it right, the agelid.
Adelgid, yes, adelgid.
Adelgid, yes. Is that something that also affects houseplants? Somebody has white spots on her houseplants. I'm thinking that
There's-
might be mealybug.
Right, that's mealy, and mealybug is a soft scale, where adelgid is a woolly aphid. So they're not closely related, but they are doing the same thing. They are sucking nutrients from the leaf, and they can be controlled the same way with soaps, timed to get it before they get the scale, before they get the woolly stuff on them, because the woolly stuff is protecting.
Okay. Hang on, I'm kind of scrolling through this. Talking about the seven sun tree,
Yes.
seven sun shrub, with regard to the monarchs, if people are collecting non-native species, how do they know that they won't cause problems in a new habitat?
Well, we don't know that. We know that there are some that are causing a problem because it's causing some of the monarchs to not migrate. The presence of one of the non-native milkweeds around the Louisiana area is causing some disruption. We don't know that that's a problem here, but we do know that they are nectaring and leaving and not staying around here. So I'm not too concerned about it yet, but that's a field that I can't really get into in any great extent.
Is there something that we should be watching on a seven sun shrub for damage?
We don't.
Early warning signs, or
we don't know yet.
Okay.
Right now, it's an unidentified canker. The horticulturists that I've talked to, who also say we watch for ants climbing up the plant. We go, why are ants climbing up the plant? It appears that they're collecting something at the site of the. But we don't know yet, and I'm sure we'll find out eventually.
Okay. And Carol is asking, is it only important to clean up the old peony debris before the new growth starts in spring?
That's what's most important, but it's most simple. That's what's most important, because that's the new stuff coming up gets infected. But you're better to do it in the fall, because some of the infection, when it's bad, will follow down in the middle of the stems. And when I cut the stems in the fall, they are hollow or have a brown center, I know that the infection has already started getting into the root. So I would rather not have it go further down into the root if I could. So I try to clean them all up in the fall when it's easier and when I can keep it out of the root.
Okay, where am I? Hello. Oh, there's just so many of us. It's fabulous.
Thank you
anyways,
all. Thank you all for being here. And
yes.
Farewell.
Thank
and
you.
Stay safe.